Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. Hey everybody, welcome to a new series on the History of the Papacy podcast. We are collaborating with my friend Patrick Young of the incredible Substack Forgotten Christianity. I will leave links to the show notes on how to subscribe to Patrick's Substack. In this series and these episodes, we're going to discuss and dig deeper into the topics that Patrick covers in his Substack. But before we get started, Patrick, why don't you just introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, thanks, Steve, for having me on. I appreciate it. Just a little bit of background on myself. I was raised evangelical Protestant and was in the Protestant church up until about 12 years ago. And the reason I had started drifting away from evangelicalism specifically and toward a higher church expression, higher liturgy, is because I started reading church history. I started reading the church fathers, digging into just the very fascinating story of the church. So not just reading commentaries on scripture or their thoughts on theology, but just their lives and what the church was all about. And through that, and it was a very long process because, at least for me, change is hard, right? And so I started digging in probably about 2002, 2003. And long story short, we became Reformed Calvinists at one point, and then we were almost received into the Catholic Church after having attended for 2 years. We were 3 days away from becoming confirmed in the Catholic faith. Couldn't quite do it. The papacy was a big problem, especially this last Pope, Pope Francis. We couldn't bring at least myself, the whole, and by the way, my whole family, all 9 of us converted at the same time when we were about to convert in the Catholic Church. Didn't do it. I had known about Orthodoxy. I knew that it was probably a better way, in my view anyway. And it was something that was difficult. It's very easy to find a Catholic service. It's very easy to find a Catholic church. Orthodoxy is a little bit more difficult as just because there's just not as many of them. But I knew after a lot of study and a lot of prayer, that was the right path for us. And so in 2021, we were received into the church here in Cedar Park, St. John the Forerunner. That's my background. So I've got a really good flavor and experience. I have a degree in history from UCLA. And so that combined with having been in the evangelical church, the Reformed church, the Catholic church, and now Orthodox, I feel like I have a pretty good rounded view of Christianity and the different denominations and so on. Anyway, so that's just a brief background on myself. As to why I wanted to start Forgotten Christianity. This is something I'm passionate about. I love church history. I love digging in and finding out about things that a lot of people don't think about. When it comes to Christianity, a lot of people don't think about where their faith came from, how they got their faith, how they got the Bible. Why do we believe in the two natures of Christ? Why do we believe in the Trinity? These are all questions that I didn't have answers to when I first started. And I know from having, anecdotally anyway, from having lots of conversations over the last decade and a half about this kind of thing, the majority of Christians don't really know. So that's why I started the Substack.
Well, I found it really interesting when I started digging into your Substack, and I didn't even know you had a Substack. And then I'm not even sure how I stumbled on it, but then I saw all of these little nuggets you were doing. It's really up the alley of what I like to do in this podcast, is find an interesting story and dig into it. And this first one is we're going to start working through some of the most impactful episodes in Christianity. And this one, your very first Substack article was on probably one of the most impactful episodes in entire Western history and probably world history. And that's the Norman invasion of Anglo-Saxon England in 1066. And listeners of the history of the papacy will be well familiar with the Norman invasion of Anglo-Saxon England. But we're going to look at this event through a different light, through a religious light, which I don't think most people look at it through. But this was a real, even though it was all Western Christianity at this time, it's a real culture clash. And it's not even just two cultures. There's at least three cultures involved with this monumental invasion of England. So let's start with the beginning, with a little background. What makes these freshly Romanized Vikings from northern France, which that's a whole story in and of itself. But
yes, it is.
What brings them to invade across the English Channel?
So the William the Bastard, as he was known before, he was William the Conqueror, he's a relative of the King of England, of Edward the Confessor, right? Who's historians largely consider Edward the Confessor the last Orthodox king of England, right? He's the last Anglo-Saxon king. Now you could say Harold, his brother-in-law, who took over and then was later killed at Hastings just a few months later. Maybe he was the last Anglo-Saxon king, technically, but really it's Edward the Confessor, who is venerated as an Orthodox saint and as well as Catholic. And he dies in 1066, in January of 1066. No heirs. His brother-in-law is crowned king, King Harold. And then he takes over as king. But meanwhile, his cousin, the William, who is connected through, I think it's his mother-in-law. The connections, I'm blanking on the connection for a moment here, but he has claim to the throne. He actually has, I believe, a blood connection to the throne. And so he decides he's going to invade England and take the throne from Harold. Interestingly, before he does this, though, the Harold I of Norway actually invades in the north of England in early September. And he's assisted by Harold's brother who betrays the king. It's the brother of Harold with King Harold, spelled differently, with a little bit differently, but they invade. King Harold comes up, defeats them, and then finds out that William has invaded in the south. So he immediately marches his army down south, and he meets them down there in October. And the battle's very close. The Normans almost lose. They were almost kicked off the island, but Harold actually catches an arrow, and if you look at, and dies. And that was it for once he's dead, then the rest, as I say, is history. Now, if you look at some of the tapestries and the depictions of the time, it'll show an arrow through Harold's eye, which is it's a dishonorable way to die, right? It shows that he's defeated or crushed or whatever you might say. It's probably unlikely that he got an arrow through the eye, but who knows? But anyway, it's a classic on one level, and this is the level we hear about all the time in school. Everybody knows about the Norman invasion of 1066. They know about the Doomsday Book, which we'll talk about and probably in another episode. But it's very interesting that a lot of so many of the formative things around the faith, around Christianity that really impacted the people on the ground are just completely omitted, right? The bloodthirsty, I wouldn't say bloodthirsty, the power hungry William decides he wants the English king, the English crown, and he gets a blessing and he is actually given a mandate by the papacy to go into England and to get rid of all of the, I say Orthodox, but we have to, let me back up. You have to remember that it's one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church at this point. There is no Roman Catholic, right? There is no Eastern Orthodox in terms of the way we would talk about it with modern labels. There's just one church, and it worships and it sees itself very much and very consistently the way that the Orthodox Church is even today, right? There's married priests. They venerate icons, relics, saints, etc. There's fasting, there's confession, there's liturgical chants, incense, processions. cetera, et cetera. There's no universal bishop, to be clear. There is no, the idea that there's one bishop and that bishop is Rome, that's a new thing that's barely emerging at this time, right? It's just emerging in the sense that the Roman papacy is trying to exert power over the whole church, right? Historically, there are 5 major sees, Rome being one of them, and the other 4 being Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, right? Rome, 12 years before the invasion of England by the Normans, decides it's going to break with the rest of the church over supremacy claims. And there's other things involved there too. But a lot of it was they're just trying to exert their authority. And by they, Rome, it wasn't just the Pope that was trying to do this. It was his cardinals and the people around him really trying to elevate the papacy to pretty much a king or an emperor rather than a bishop as it was for 1,000 years. So that's the frame that we're walking into with 1066. It's a church that's unified. It's a church that, yes, there had been a papal bull thrown down in Constantinople and excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople, and then the Patriarch Michael excommunicated the Pope. That had happened, yes, but you got to remember the church doesn't just it doesn't just split because you signed a paper. It takes decades and in fact centuries before the schism is fully realized, I guess is the right word, right? So for decades and decades after, well into the 1100s, the 12th century, the church sees itself still as one holy Catholic and apostolic church. It doesn't see the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Church, if that makes sense.
Hey, Steve here. If you're enjoying the History of the Papacy podcast, consider joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. We're working toward going completely listener funded, which means no more ads ever. When you join, you get early access to episodes, monthly book giveaways, and most importantly, your name is added to the History of the Papacy Diptychs, our own list of commemorated supporters. You can become an Antioch level supporter for just $3 per month. But it makes a huge difference to making the History of the Papacy ad-free and independent. Nobody likes ads, not you, not me, and I'm the guy who records them. So let's just get rid of them. Visit patreon.com/History of the Papacy and join today.
Soldiers, you are about to embark upon the Great Crusade.
From Focus Features and the producers of Darkest Hour.
There are 2 major storms advancing towards the Normandy coast.
Experience the untold true story of D-Day.
If you invade tomorrow, they're going to be washed away.
An inspiring story of courage, sacrifice, and the mission that gave the free world hope.
We will accept nothing less than full victory.
Crusher, the untold true story of D-Day. Rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. Only in theaters today. Discovered at Dolby Cinema.
Hi, everyone. If you've been injured in an accident that was not your fault, listen up. We have legal professionals standing by to answer your questions for free. Call now and find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth. Call 800-910-7500. I'm here with spokesman John Wolf. So, John, tell everyone listening who should call right now.
Well, Maria, first off, thank you for having me here. It's always nice to answer the listeners' questions. Now, as far as who should call in, anyone who's been injured in an accident and think you deserve compensation, give us a call right now. 800-910-7500. You'll find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth.
Thanks, John. You heard it, folks. Take advantage of this opportunity and call now. 800-910-7500.
Advertisement sponsored by Legal Help Center. May not be available in all states. Not available in California.
Yeah, and really at that point, there had been a pretty deep schism not too earlier with the Photian schism between the East and the West. And I think that at that point, because the Great Schism of 1054 is just, like you said, it's just the previous decade, they probably figured that this was something like these other schisms that would have just kind of ironed itself out a little bit. And after time, I don't think anybody, and it really never it took a long time for it to set into the point where we would have it, where you would see it today as two separate churches that are completely unmoored to each other. That took centuries for that. And it was cultural aspects and political, a couple of crusades come down the line.
Absolutely. And this is something that I'm going to dive in. The church saw itself as one. Even after 1054, it very much thought it was going to repair itself, right? It's not until decades, even a century or 2 centuries later, that people are like, okay, we really are two different churches. But even with the Council of Florence in the 1400s, they were still trying to put it back together, right? You still had, and that wasn't the only attempt. There was a couple of attempts to put the church back together. I'm going to explore that in future posts on Forgotten Christianity. But it's really interesting because you would have Byzantine, and we're getting a little off topic here, but you would have, I say Byzantine, that's a 19th century term coined by an English historian to differentiate the Eastern Roman Empire from the Western Roman Empire. But the Eastern Emperor, at least twice put himself underneath the papacy to try to pull everything back together for both political reasons and spiritual reasons. But it never really worked out because the people just wouldn't have it, right? And the Eastern bishops would not have it either. But that said, the church in England pre-1066 is very much looks Eastern Orthodox as we would know it today, right? There's no one bishop. The veneration of relics and of images is very much a real thing. It worships like the East. Even the Roman Rite, while it's a little bit different than the Byzantine Rite or the Eastern Roman Rite, it's still very similar. But anyway, from that rite, you get the Gregorian chant, it's sometimes called the Gregorian Rite, and which later develops into the liturgy that's used in the Church of England. And I do want to be clear: the Church in England pre-1066 is very different than the Church of England that develops during the Reformation, when King Henry VIII parts ways with the papacy. Those are two very different, while related, very different things. So to your point, you have these different cultures. You got the Celtic Church with some of their practices. You've got the English Church, which is following St. Augustine of Canterbury, not to be confused with St. Augustine of Hippo, but St. Augustine of Canterbury, who was sent by Gregory the Great, who is Gregory I, who's also known as a pope because he was the Bishop of Rome. He sends him to England. He sends St. Augustine to England to get them in line with Roman practice, with the practice of the rest of the church, basically. And then eventually at the Synod of Whitby, in I think it's 664, the English Church and the Celtic Church come together and they sort out a few things, and they make sure that, okay, the date of Easter is the same. The way we do the tonssuring rule, and the tonssuring for priests and for monks is the same, et cetera, et cetera. I think they cut their hair differently, and so they had to fix that, which is funny. But yeah, so it's very much a unified, while there are local flavors a little bit, but that's very much a unified church, East and West, the British Isles and the rest of Europe, and it's very much one church. And it's not the big deal. And the big deal with the Normans coming in is that what the Normans did, and what you don't realize, I think many people didn't realize, I didn't realize this until I really started digging into this. The Norman invasion really shattered and changed the English speaking world, and we don't even realize it. One other practical way, besides, we'll talk about this in a minute, which is what the Normans did when they came into England. But we don't realize that even our own language because of the Norman invasion and the infusion of French and Latin, because of the Normans, that's how we get the modern language of English, right? If you were to go back and look at and try to read or even speak to, if you could, somebody from the pre-invasion England, it would be very difficult because it's very much Germanic and Anglo-Saxon. The Norman invasion, it certainly is a pivotal event.
What I think it's interesting with the Norman invasion is that the papacy at this point, they've come out of a pretty rough century before, and it's almost strikes me as homogenizing everything. They want everybody to be, like you said, almost down to the haircut that they're using, that they wanted to really standardize the practices throughout their entire bishopric, which was essentially the entire west of Western Europe. And then if you were in Spain to England to Scotland, which was still within the one church at that point, they wanted everybody doing more or less the same thing. And that's a big part of what the Gregorian reforms were about.
Mm-hmm. It was, but it was also, the Gregorian reforms also were centralizing power around the papacy, right? It wasn't just about making things uniform. The Franks tried to make things uniform throughout the 7th and 8th centuries, right? 10th centuries. Right. Famously, Charlemagne tries to standardize a bunch of different things across the West. Also tries to make himself emperor of the Romans. He has himself crowned king of the Romans in 800, Christmas Day 800 in Rome by Pope Leo III. And it's crazy to me, and I didn't even realize this until after I was Orthodox and thinking about this a lot. I'm like, wait a second, there already was a king of the Romans. He was in Constantinople, right? So Charlemagne calling himself king of the Romans is really throwing down the gauntlet and saying, hey, there's two different aspects to this, and there's almost two different churches. So the cracks in the, if you will, in the church foundation, they definitely start centuries earlier, right? But it's not until the Great Schism and then with something like the Norman invasion where you have radical change in just a few short decades.
Yeah, and you really get it. This is the time where the western part of Europe is starting to get its muscle back again. They had taken a pretty big whooping, you might say, over the course of 3 centuries with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, then the Gothic Wars between the Eastern Roman Empire and Italy. Mm-hmm. Then there's some climactic issues that happen. Then the Muslim invasion, which hit Western Europe harder than most people think. And now they're starting to coalesce again. These individual kingdoms are getting a lot stronger, and the Viking invasions, which we hinted at, that these Normans were just essentially Vikings that had started wearing Roman clothing, and they're trying to integrate into the Roman Empire. Now you have the Western Europe and vis-a-vis the papacy is getting more muscular, and that's where we're going to see the Crusades start launching soon as well.
Sometimes people think, the first time the Pope sanctions military intervention is 1095 when he calls for the First Crusade. No, this happens earlier. He called for the invasion of England here decades before that, right? And there's other examples as well, but it really is a time of radical change. And it speeds up, because most historians who study this period will tell you the 12th century, if you were sitting in Western Europe in 1100 and then you were able to spend the entire century there and you were still there in 1200, you would not recognize it. It completely changes because of the actions that happen in the mid to late 11th century, 1054, all the way through. You have through the end of the century, is these radical changes are happening, and the Gregorian reforms are happening. They're trying to make the Pope is trying to make everybody be celibate. If you're a priest, obviously that if you're a priest and you're celibate, then you don't have a family and you're going to be more loyal to the church, i.e. to the Pope. There's all kinds of things that are happening, and really radical things that are changing the church. And it drastically changes Western Europe over the next 100, 150 years.
Maybe let's talk a little bit about the power of the Pope at that time. We've been dancing around it, but even a Pope himself discusses that this universal idea that's still even just very much in its infancy in the year 1000. But they really do have a project to expanding the depth of the power of the Pope, even as early as this time period.
Yeah, they certainly do. But previous to that, there are lots of people in the West, and even popes, St. Gregory most famously, I think, he basically says anybody who calls himself a universal bishop is a precursor of the Antichrist, right? there is no such thing as a universal bishop, right? This is Saint Gregory, Pope Gregory the First saying this, right? And of course, this is in the 600s. So there's lots of pushback, even by popes, that there is no such thing as a universal bishop, right? But then, like you said, Pope Leo the Ninth, he's the pope that was pope when the Great Schism happened. He's the one that put it in motion. He was actually dead. I don't know if you knew this, but he actually died a couple months before his cardinals threw down the papal bull in Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. So technically, the Great Schism was illegal because you can't operate on the behalf of a dead pope, right? So it's pretty fascinating to think about that. But the pope that really gets things moving after the Great Schism, and I'm calling the Great Schism being just 1054, is Pope Gregory VII. Pope Gregory VII really pushes hard on papal power. He pushes really heavy on priestly celibacy. It's not until the next century that they make it official at a church council, but the Latin church. But he presses hard against kings, famously against the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, where he has the Holy Roman Emperor come to his winter palace, and he sits famously, supposedly, the emperor begs for forgiveness, and he stands outside Pope Gregory VII's winter retreat for 3 days. So it's and then finally Pope Gregory says, okay, fine, I'll forgive you and you can have communion. So it's this back and forth between the temporal powers and the spiritual powers, if you will, where the Pope is trying to exert authority over secular powers, unlike we've ever seen than we've ever seen ever, right? This really all starts to happen in the second half of the 11th century.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
Soldiers, you are about to embark upon the Great Crusade.
From Focus Features and the producers of Darkest Hour.
There are two major storms advancing towards the Normandy coast.
Experience the untold true story of D-Day.
If you invade tomorrow, they're going to be washed away.
An inspiring story of courage, sacrifice, and the mission that gave the free world hope.
We will accept nothing less than full victory.
Fresher, the untold true story of D-Day. Rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. Only in theaters today. Discover it at Dolby Cinema.
Hi, everyone. If you've been injured in an accident that was not your fault, listen up. We have legal professionals standing by to answer your questions for free. Call now and find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth. Call 800-910-7500. I'm here with spokesman John Wolf. So, John, tell everyone listening who should call right now.
Well, Maria, first off, thank you for having me here. It's always nice to answer the listeners' questions. Now, as far as who should call in, anyone who's been injured in an accident and think you deserve compensation, give us a call right now. 800-910-7500. You'll find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth.
Thanks, John. You heard it, folks. Take advantage of this opportunity and call now. 800-910-7500.
Advertisement sponsored by Legal Help Center. May not be available in all states. Not available in California.
Yeah, you really see it in it had been an early development of the church and going all the way back to the point where Christianity had been legalized and it started to fuse into the Roman Empire. But there was still what you might call a separation of church and state that it still existed to some degree in Constantinople and in the eastern sections where the religious authority fairly much did its own thing, and there was a push and a pull between the religious authorities and the secular authorities. But in Western Europe at this time, they're really getting melded together into one thing. And that's what these fights, the showdown at Canossa and all these things are. Who's going to be running this show? And that's where the battle lines are being drawn.
Yeah, and it's very fascinating. Throughout, once as you mentioned, Christianity is legalized in 313 at the Edict of Milan by St. Constantine, then there becomes, from that point until now, I guess you could argue, there's a push and a pull from secular powers. How much can the emperor or the king do versus how much authority does he have versus the bishop? or the metropolitan or the patriarch, right? So it just, sometimes you have the emperor calling for church councils, but then he lets the church leaders run the thing, right? Which is what happened to a lot of the councils, but famously Constantine called the first council in 325 at Nicaea. He called it, but he presided over it, so to speak, but it was church leaders. It was the bishops that made the decisions that decided on the creed and so on. You could make arguments at different times, different leaders exerted more power than others. That's certainly true. But yeah, at this time in the West, when we're talking about the invasion of England, it's much, the Pope is making strides that you haven't seen before in terms of power.
Even though we really didn't get into the Normans at all in this episode, and we will in future episodes, I think it's important to lay out that last piece of the puzzle, which really made the church in England unique. It's in Christendom, really, at that point, and this influence of the Celtic churches.
It was almost like just process, if you will. At least that's my read on it, and digging into all of this is they just celebrated Easter at a different time, usually very early. The Celtic Church did. They had different monastic practices, different tantring practices, but they still venerated icons. They still had all the fasting rules and all of that. They still did all the things that the rest of the church did. But it wasn't until Whitby that they brought all those in line. And of course, that's in 664, right? So think about that. They bring everything in line at 664. And so all across the British Isles, it's pretty much the same, right? No matter where you go, no matter what Christian church you go into, it's virtually the same. You're going to celebrate Easter and Pascha at the same time. You're going to do all the things that you would normally do in a church. And then from 664 until 1066, so 400 years, right? 400 years, there's not much change. And then, as we'll talk about in the future, is the Normans come in and start uprooting and I'll use the word persecuting any bishop, any abbot, and to a large degree, any priest that opposed the papacy. So it's very interesting because this is the idea that you would come in and you would uproot and you would get rid of. So with the Norman invasion, the church that had been won, as we discussed throughout this episode, was effectively purged of any clergy, whether that be a bishop or that be a priest or that be an abbot, effectively, and we'll talk about this in the next episode, I think, here. But the Normans come in and they do something that is pretty common in a secular world, where you would eliminate, if you came to power as a king, you would eliminate all of your possible rivals. And so what they do is they go in and they effectively eliminate all of the clergy that are not loyal to Rome. And they don't kill them. They do other things. We'll talk about that. All of this causes mass exodus of nobles and other people of means to leave the islands, to leave Britain. And many of them, and this is something that I found extremely fascinating, is you've got the Normans that come in, they purge the clergy, and they push everybody out that's not loyal to Rome. And then you've got tens of thousands of Britons fleeing all over Europe. Many of them actually go to Constantinople. And there is and then we'll talk about this in more detail, but there is a New England on the shores of the Black Sea where a lot of them end up. So that's something that we'll talk about in future episodes. It's just pretty wild to think about. For example, Harold's daughter flees and she goes to Kiev, and she marries one of the princes in Kiev, and the lines are very intertwined, if you will, but it really shows with the Exodus and the not just the clergy, that some of the clergy that leave, but it's also so many of the nobles and other people, in fact, some commoners, they go to Constantinople and they go to Kiev, Why? Because it's one church and they're accepted there as fellow Christians, right? So it really much does tie together the whole thing that this is one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church that's being changed by the Norman invasion and being changed, again, very rapidly. And we'll also look at, coming up here, we'll look at clergy that decided to fight back with a pen rather than a sword, and basically puts down, this is in Northern England, Anonymous of York, right around 1100, puts down a whole series of things on paper that the papacy is violating, if you will. And it reads like somebody from the Orthodox Church wrote it. It's really fascinating stuff. But anyway, yeah, all that to say, the church, pre-Norman invasion, very much unified, very much together. The different cultures, the Celtic culture, the English culture, the Roman culture, all kind of fused together to have this beautiful and very, very robust church for 400 plus years until the Normans came in and radically changed the landscape.
I think the most fascinating part of this is that in written records, it's the first time we really see where the intellectual elite, the religious elite, the ruling elite, it just gets completely cut off cleanly. And the base population, you might say, they're still there. And to see that we're more or less seeing that happen in real time in the invasion of Anglo-Saxon England in a way that we've really never seen it before, or never recorded before.
Yeah, usually with the famous Viking invasions of the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, right? By the way, Harold I of Norway, who was he was in the Varangian Guard serving the emperor in Constantinople, just to give you a full view of how connected the church was in all of Europe, right? And we'll talk about the Varangians in future episodes as well, because that's an important component. But they're basically the Praetorian Guard of ancient Rome, right? They're the elite bodyguards and troops of the Roman emperor. But anyway, Harold I of Norway, who's killed, I mentioned earlier, is killed when he tries to invade England. That's really considered the last Viking invasion of England, right? In September of 1066. Anyway, it's really interesting how the Vikings would come in, they would conquer the people, and then they would intermingle and mix and fuse the cultures together, where, to your point here, Steve, is very much the Normans came in and they just cut everything off. They literally cut everything off. If you look at who owned property, and I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here, but if you look at who owned property in England in 1066, it's Anglo-Saxon, it's the English. If you look at the Domesday Book in 1086, 20 years later, it's almost all Normans. It's almost all French or people that are not native English, right? They completely take over everything and wipe out even the memory of what came before, so that we don't even think about, when we learn about William the Conqueror, we learn about the Normans coming in, we don't even think about the religious aspect of it, which was massive. And it's really shifted the way the West developed, and especially in England and the British Isles.
Well, I want to thank you so much Patrick for coming on today. We've just even given the tiniest taste of what's coming up. So I hope people enjoyed. Send your feedback and look for Patrick's Substack, links in the show notes. And yeah, we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it. I look forward to it.
The Historical Jesus Podcast is the sweeping saga of the life and times of Galilean Jesus of Nazareth, as well as the faith, religion, and church founded to honor and disseminate his acts and teachings. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this fascinating journey through time, exploring the many great works of Christian theology, literature, architecture, music, and art inspired by the words and deeds of Jesus Christ.
Hi, everyone. If you've been injured in an accident that was not your fault, listen up. We have legal professionals standing by to answer your questions for free. Call now and find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth. Call 800-910-7500. I'm here with spokesman John Wolf. So, John, tell everyone listening who should call right now.
Well, Maria, first off, thank you for having me here. It's always nice to answer the listeners' questions. Now, as far as who should call in, anyone who's been injured in an accident and think you deserve compensation, give us a call right now. 800-910-7500. You'll find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth.
Thanks, John. You heard it, folks. Take advantage of this opportunity and call now. 800-910-7500.
Advertisement sponsored by Legal Help Center may not be available in all states, not available in California.